Imagine standing in a crowd in 1859, not at a festival, not at a market, but at what was chillingly called the Great Slave Auction. 436 men, women, and children, human beings with names, families, dreams, were paraded like cattle before eager buyers. The rain poured, the air was heavy, and yet the business of selling lives carried on without pause. For 2 brutal days in Savannah, Georgia, the largest slave sale in American history unfolded, forever etching its stain into the nation's memory. To the wealthy bidders, this was a chance to invest, to profit, to secure more labor for their plantations. To the enslaved, it was a nightmare of separation. Husbands torn from wives, mothers ripped away from their children, families broken in the blink of an auctioneer's gavel. They called it a sale, but in truth, it was state-sanctioned human trafficking, dressed in the language of commerce and law. The irony? Just 2 years later, the Civil War would erupt. A war fought over the very system that made this grotesque spectacle possible. But in 1859, there was no relief, no freedom, no justice, only chains, tears, and the sound of numbers shouted over lives. This is not just a story of the past, it is a mirror held up to America's darkest truths. Today, we revisit the Great Slave Auction to uncover the cruelty, hypocrisy, and human suffering that defined this infamous event. Because to forget it would be to excuse it. The year was 1859, and the United States stood on the edge of collapse. Tensions between North and South had reached a boiling point, yet the heartbeat of the Southern economy still relied on slavery. Cotton was king, and enslaved labor was its crown. Savannah, Georgia, was no ordinary port city. It was a hub of wealth built directly on the backs of enslaved Africans. Ships came and went, fortunes rose and fell, but the trade in human beings remained constant, an accepted part of daily life. The Butler plantation, one of the grand estates of Georgia, belonged to Pierce Mies Butler. Descended from one of the wealthiest families in the South, Butler had inherited both land and people. Yet mismanagement, gambling, and extravagant living plunged him into crushing debt. To save himself financially, Butler made a decision that would forever scar American history. He ordered the sale of 436 enslaved men, women, and children, the largest auction of human lives in U.S. history. It was a desperate act of greed disguised as necessity. Newspapers across the South advertised the coming event. Slave traders, planters, and speculators marked their calendars. This was not merely a sale, it was a spectacle, the kind of grotesque business that reduced human suffering to entertainment and profit. For the enslaved, whispers of the sale spread fear. They knew what was coming. Families would be torn apart, communities destroyed. Some clung to prayer, others to silence, but all shared the same fate, being treated as numbers on a ledger. Thus, the stage was set. Savannah was about to host a market of misery, remembered by survivors not as a simple transaction, but as the weeping time. Slave auctions were not spontaneous events, they were carefully planned businesses. Organizers treated them like livestock markets, with order, precision, and an eye for profit. Human beings were reduced to assets, measured by strength, age, and market demand. Weeks before the auction, advertisements appeared in newspapers. They announced the great sale of Negroes, as if it were a festival. Traders, planters, and speculators were invited to attend, promising a rare opportunity to purchase prime field hands and skilled workers. The auction site was prepared with the efficiency of a county fair. Tents were raised on the racecourse near Savannah. Inside, the enslaved were housed, guarded, and inspected like cattle waiting for the butcher's block. Prospective buyers walked among them, poking at muscles, examining teeth, and questioning abilities. Mothers were forced to stand with infants in their arms while strangers debated their value. Every gesture, every look was stripped of humanity. Auctioneers studied the crowd, ready to manipulate emotion and competition. Their goal was simple: drive prices higher, no matter the cost to the lives being sold. The suffering of the enslaved was irrelevant. It was all about numbers. Behind closed doors, buyers calculated profit margins. How many years of labor could this man provide? How many children could this woman bear? It was a science of cruelty, where people were transformed into projections of future earnings. By the time the sale began, everything was in place. To the enslavers, it was business. To the enslaved, it was a nightmare with no escape. On March 2nd, 1859, the numbers became flesh. 436 enslaved men, women, and children were marched into holding pens, waiting for their fate. They were not listed by name, but by age, skill, and price. The buyers saw lots, but each lot was a life. There was Samson, a strong young man valued for his ability to endure the fields. There was Ansi, a mother clutching her child, terrified that the gavel would separate them forever. Children as young as 2 were included. They were appraised not for what they could do now, but for the future labor they represented. Human innocence was turned into an investment. Families were deliberately broken apart. Husbands were sold to one plantation, wives to another. Siblings were torn from each other's arms. The cry of a child or the silence of despair filled the air as numbers replaced relationships. The records tell us some prices. A skilled male field hand might fetch $150. A mother with children was often discounted, seen as a burden rather than a blessing. The cold mathematics of the market crushed human bonds. Inside the tents, enslaved people waited with dread. They whispered to one another, clung to their loved ones, and prayed in silence. For them, this was not simply a sale. It was the destruction of identity, community, and hope. To the buyers, it was opportunity. To the enslaved, it was the weeping time, a name passed down through memory and sorrow. The skies over Savannah opened with heavy rain as the sale began. For 2 days, the downpour did not stop, soaking the tents and muddying the racecourse grounds. To many of the enslaved, the rain felt like the heavens themselves were mourning. Despite the storm, the buyers arrived in great numbers. Planters, traders, and speculators came from across Georgia, South Carolina, and beyond. The weather could not wash away the lure of profit. Inside the auction tents, the enslaved were brought forward one by one, families clinging to each other until the last possible moment. Auctioneers shouted descriptions: strong young man, healthy woman, skilled carpenter, reducing lives to advertisements. The bidding began with cold efficiency. Voices rose, prices climbed, and the sound of the gavel echoed like a hammer sealing a coffin. Each strike meant another family shattered, another life sold to the highest bidder. Journalists who witnessed the scene later described the eerie silence of the enslaved. They did not cry out. They did not resist. Most stood in stunned quiet, holding their pain deep within. To resist would only bring the whip. Yet the silence was louder than any words. Mothers pressed their children close, knowing they might never see them again. Men stood tall, but their eyes betrayed despair. The weight of hopelessness filled the tent heavier than the rain. For the buyers, the auction was a social event. They laughed, bargained, and congratulated one another on their purchases. To them, it was simply commerce. To the enslaved, it was a funeral without coffins. Some families tried to stay together by begging buyers to purchase them as a group. In rare cases, a sympathetic buyer agreed. But for most, those pleas fell on deaf ears. Profit outweighed mercy every time. By the end of March 3rd, the tally was complete. 436 souls had been sold, generating nearly $303,000 for Pierce Butler, an enormous sum in 1859, built entirely on human suffering. When the gavel fell for the final time, silence settled. For the enslaved, it was not the end of the auction, but the beginning of a new nightmare on unfamiliar plantations. For the buyers, it was simply another deal closed. Outside, the rain still poured. Survivors later called it the weeping time, believing that nature itself wept for them when the world would not. To the enslavers, the great auction was not about tears or families, it was about numbers. Pierce Butler, drowning in debt from gambling and mismanagement, saw 436 lives as his ticket back to solvency. His ledger mattered more than their future. The final profit of the auction reached nearly $303,000, equivalent to millions today. Each body sold was a coin in Butler's pocket. For him, the sale was a lifeline. For the enslaved, it was a death sentence of identity. Buyers spoke in the language of investment. They calculated labor years, breeding potential, and resale value. Men were weighed for their strength, women for their fertility, children for their future productivity. Human dignity was erased by arithmetic. The enslaved were classified by categories: prime field hand, skilled artisan, child, elder. To buyers, these labels meant profit margins. To the enslaved, they were chains disguised as words. Some buyers walked away proud of their good deals. They congratulated themselves on acquiring strong laborers at fair prices, as if they had bought fine horses or sturdy mules. Their joy was another's despair. The cruelty of the system lay in its normalization. No one present questioned the morality. Newspapers covered the auction like any other business story, praising the organization, noting the prices, ignoring the tears. Meanwhile, the enslaved measured the cost differently. A mother did not think in dollars. She thought of the child torn from her arms. A husband did not see a sale price. He saw the empty space where his wife once stood. The true profit of the auction cannot be counted in money. It was counted in broken families, shattered lives, and stolen futures. The human loss was immeasurable, echoing across generations. But in 1859, those echoes were ignored. Ledger books closed, profits recorded, debts repaid. The enslavers congratulated themselves, blind to the fact that their wealth was written in human pain. History remembers the numbers, but behind each dollar was a life, and no amount of profit could ever erase the shame of the weeping time. The Great Slave Auction was not hidden in the shadows. It was witnessed, documented, and reported. The voices that survived give us glimpses of both cruelty and indifference. Newspapers covered the event like a business spectacle. Reports in Savannah and Charleston papers listed prices, buyers, and the success of the sale. They praised the efficiency of the auctioneer, noting how smoothly the process ran. Humanity was erased in ink. One reporter described the scene with cold detachment. Rows of enslaved people waiting in silence, buyers haggling over bids, the gavel falling over and over. He noted the rain, the mud, the discomfort of the buyers, yet gave little thought to the suffering of the enslaved. Another journalist remarked on the remarkable quiet of those being sold. Not a sound was heard, he wrote, failing to recognize that silence was born not from acceptance, but from terror and despair. To enslaved people, a cry might invite punishment. There were also witnesses who could not stomach what they saw. An abolitionist visitor later wrote of the anguish, calling the sale a funeral of human hope. To him, the rain was no accident. It was nature's protest against human greed. Oral histories passed down by descendants reveal the other side. Enslaved families remembered the tears, the heartbreak, the whispers of goodbye. One survivor recalled the day as when the sky wept and we wept with it. Accounts tell of mothers begging buyers to purchase their children alongside them. In rare cases, these pleas were answered. More often, children were wrenched away, leaving mothers screaming in silence, their grief hidden in lowered eyes. Buyers, meanwhile, wrote letters home boasting of their purchases. Some praised the strength of their new laborers, others spoke of bargains struck. For them, the human element was absent. They saw only capital gained. Historians later pieced together these voices to show the dual reality, a business deal celebrated by some and a tragedy mourned by others. The divide was not just between North and South, but between those with power and those in chains. The enslaved remembered not the numbers or prices, but the separations. For them, the weeping time was a wound that never healed, a story told again and again to ensure the world could not forget. The Great Auction did not happen in a vacuum. In 1859, America stood at the edge of civil war. The nation was split in two, North and South, abolitionists and slaveholders, freedom and bondage. Every sale of human beings carried political weight. In the South, slavery was seen as a necessary institution, defended with sermons, laws, and guns. Planters claimed it was the backbone of the economy, the very foundation of Southern life. To them, auctions like Savannah's were simply business as usual. In the North, voices grew louder against the practice. Abolitionist newspapers published accounts of cruelty, spreading outrage. The image of families torn apart became a rallying cry, fueling resistance to slavery's expansion westward. Politicians argued endlessly in Congress. Each new territory asked the same question: free soil or slave soil? The future of the Union seemed to hang on that answer. By 1859, compromise was wearing thin and tempers were ready to ignite. 1 year before the auction, in 1858, Abraham Lincoln had debated Stephen Douglas, warning that "A house divided against itself cannot stand." His words rang like prophecy as Butler's enslaved families were sold. Meanwhile, enslavers doubled down on their defenses. They passed stricter slave codes, silenced dissent, and insisted that slavery was ordained by God. To them, abolition was not just dangerous, it was unthinkable. The Great Auction reflected this tension. It was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because such sales happened daily across the South. Extraordinary because its size exposed the scale of the cruelty. Within 2 years, war would break out. The very system that allowed Pierce Butler to profit from human misery would drag the nation into its bloodiest conflict. The Civil War was coming, and the cries of the enslaved were part of its thunder. The politics of 1859 were not abstract debates. They were written in the lives of 436 people sold under reign, in the ink of laws defending slavery, and in the silence of a country unwilling to face its own shame. If the Great Auction was a business transaction for the sellers, it was a massacre of families for the enslaved. The real cruelty lay not in the numbers, but in the moments when bonds of love were broken forever. Mothers held their children tightly, praying that a buyer would take them together. Some even begged on their knees, their dignity stripped, offering tears as their last defense. More often than not, those prayers went unanswered. Children too young to understand clung to skirts and arms, crying as strangers pulled them away. Their voices echoed through the tents, piercing even the sound of the auctioneer's hammer. To their mothers, it was a sound worse than death. Husbands and wives were separated with no ceremony. No farewell beyond a whispered word. A lifetime of shared labor and love was ended by a stranger's bid. Marriage, sacred in every sermon, meant nothing under slavery. Siblings who had grown up side by side were torn apart. A brother sold to South Carolina, a sister sent west to Alabama. Their childhood laughter became a memory drowned in the mud of Savannah's racetrack. One account describes a woman collapsing when her son was sold away. She screamed until her voice broke, then fell silent, her body trembling with shock. Buyers looked on, unmoved. To them, it was a distraction from business. Even in their final moments together, families showed courage. They embraced tightly, whispered names, and vowed to remember each other. Memory was their only weapon against forced erasure. The buyers rarely saw this as cruelty. To them, families were a liability. Keeping them together meant less profit. Breaking them apart maximized gain. The humanity of the enslaved was sacrificed to the arithmetic of greed. For the enslaved, the pain lasted generations. Stories of separation were passed down, retold by grandchildren who never met their uncles, cousins, or grandparents because of that sale. Family trees were cut down before they could grow. This was the deepest wound of the Great Auction, not just the chains, not just the price tags, but the deliberate destruction of family, the most human bond of all. It is why survivors called it the weeping time. Though the auction broke families and scattered lives, it did not destroy the spirit of resistance. Enslaved people carried with them quiet acts of defiance, often invisible to their oppressors. Some refused to show despair during the sale. They stood silent and unbroken, denying buyers the satisfaction of seeing their fear. That silence, though born of terror, was also a shield of dignity. Others used memory as resistance. They whispered names, places, and prayers, vowing never to forget those torn from them. Memory kept families alive, even when distance and slavery tried to erase them. Songs became coded acts of defiance. Spirituals carried messages of hope, escape, and unity. Even when sung under the watchful eye of a master, the words carried secret strength for those who understood. Mothers braided seeds into their children's hair before separation, a tradition brought from Africa. In doing so, they passed down a future, a reminder that life could grow again even after exile. There were also acts of physical resistance, though dangerous. Some enslaved people attempted escape during transport to new plantations. A few succeeded, vanishing into the swamps and woods, living free though hunted. Others resisted through sabotage. Tools broke mysteriously, fields were left untended, and work slowed to a crawl. These quiet rebellions were small strikes against the system that claimed to own them. Faith, too, became resistance. Enslaved people prayed for freedom, seeing themselves as a new Israel awaiting deliverance. They carried biblical stories of Exodus in their hearts, transforming suffering into prophecy. Even the act of surviving was defiance. Every day lived was a rejection of a system designed to crush body and spirit. Every child born carried within them the resilience of generations who refused to disappear. The enslavers believed they had won, that profit and power had erased humanity. But resistance lived on, in silence, in memory, in song. And it is because of these acts that the weeping time is remembered at all. In 1859, the Great Auction ended with ledgers balanced and pockets filled, but its legacy stretched far beyond Savannah. For the enslaved, the memory of those 2 rainy days lived on in sorrow and story. They called it the weeping time. The name itself survived through oral tradition, passed from grandparents to grandchildren. It was a way of naming the grief, of ensuring that the silence of the sale would not erase the cries of the enslaved. Yet for decades, white America buried the memory. Local histories of Savannah praised its architecture, its churches, its plantations, but rarely mentioned that the city hosted the largest slave sale in U.S. history. Silence became another form of erasure. Only in the 20th century did historians begin piecing together the truth. They found newspaper clippings, plantation records, and letters that revealed the cold arithmetic of the auction. They uncovered names, prices, and ages that had been hidden in dusty ledgers. Descendants of the enslaved began to reclaim the story. Family reunions, church services, and community events turned the memory of the weeping time into a space of mourning and resilience. What was once forgotten became sacred. Today, a historical marker stands near the site of the sale, acknowledging the tragedy. Visitors read the words and stand on the same ground where families were once torn apart. The rain no longer falls, but the weight of history remains heavy. The legacy of the weeping time is not just about the past, it is about the present. It forces America to confront the reality that its wealth was built on human suffering, that its promises of freedom were written in contradiction. For the descendants, remembering is an act of justice. They keep alive the names of those sold, the bonds of family broken, and the tears shed under the Savannah sky. Their memory is resistance against forgetting. In this way, the weeping time has become more than an auction. It is a symbol of both America's darkest cruelty and the enduring strength of those who endured it. The United States in 1859 loved to call itself the land of liberty. Politicians praised freedom, preachers thundered about morality, and newspapers boasted of progress. Yet, on a muddy racetrack in Savannah, liberty was traded for cash, and morality was measured in dollars per head. Slaveholders claimed slavery was part of their Christian duty. They quoted scripture to justify chains, insisting they were civilizing Africans. But their sermons ended the moment the auctioneer raised his gavel. Apparently, the Bible was very flexible when profit was involved. America's founding fathers had written, "All men are created equal." But in practice, that meant all white men. The 436 sold at the weeping time were excluded from that promise, their humanity erased by ink on parchment and greed in the heart. The irony is staggering. A nation preparing for civil war over the principle of freedom still allowed children to be ripped from their mother's arms. Liberty was sacred, unless you were born in chains. Then it was negotiable. Even the language of the sale carried hypocrisy. Advertisements called the enslaved valuable property and prime stock. These were people with families, laughter, and pain, reduced to the vocabulary of farming equipment. The auction also revealed the South's greatest fear, that enslaved people did not accept their bondage. The silence of the enslaved during the sale was misread as obedience, when in truth it was defiance, endurance, and survival. The lesson of the weeping time is simple but brutal. When a society places profit above humanity, cruelty becomes normal, and evil disguises itself as tradition. Savannah in 1859 was not an outlier. It was the system working exactly as designed. Today, remembering the irony is essential. A nation that declared liberty while selling children must face that contradiction or risk repeating it in new forms. Forgetting is dangerous. Memory is resistance. The real lesson is not just about 1859. It is about us. Do we recognize when profit still comes at the expense of human dignity? Do we see when voices are silenced, when families are broken, when injustice is justified as necessary? History's dark ironies are not locked in the past. The Great Slave Auction of 1859 is remembered not only as the largest sale of human beings in American history, but also as one of its deepest wounds. The ledgers recorded profit, but memory preserved grief. The weeping time was more than 2 days of rain. It was centuries of pain condensed into one tragic event. It was the sound of families torn apart, the silence of survival, and the enduring strength of memory. Its legacy reminds us that slavery was not abstract. It was lived in tears, in names erased, in children taken. It was real, brutal, and lasting. And the echoes of that cruelty still shape the world we live in today. History forces us to look into the mirror. America's ideals of liberty and equality were betrayed in Savannah, and to ignore that betrayal is to let injustice hide in plain sight. Remembering is not optional. It is necessary. Because forgetting is another form of violence, and remembering is the first step toward justice. If this story moved you, don't let it fade into silence. Share it, talk about it, and keep the memory of the weeping time alive. History is not just the past, it's the foundation of our present. By remembering, we honor those who endured and ensure their suffering is not erased. If you want more hidden stories from the shadows of history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next chapter of dark history. Together, we keep memory alive.